get the whole program done. Our next lecture is by Kurt Reed, and he's going to talk to us about the interactions specifically between the Dorflinger factories and the Corning factories. I had talked to him some time ago about new information he's been coming up with about the association between the Dorflinger and the Hawks factory and some others. So I particularly, up to a point, we've built this around the Corning area factories, partly because we just opened the Crystal City exhibit. But we also wanted to have new information about several other standard factories. So it's not confined to the American lectures are not obviously not confined to the Corning factories. But this one at least will touch on that. Mr. Reed is a native of Lake Ariel, Pennsylvania, and is an independent antique dealer and a glass researcher, and advises the Dorflinger Museum in White Mills. With Walter Barb, he's working on a book about the glass industry of Wayne County, Pennsylvania, which existed from 1806 to 1932. And in talking to both of them, I've been really surprised about how much glassmaking there was in Wayne County, far more than we usually associate just White Mills and Honesdale, but there was a lot more going on than there. So in his seminar lecture, Kurt is going to talk to us about some of his discoveries in Louis Dorflinger's diary, and especially the new material he's found relating Dorflinger and the Corning firms. Okay, thank you, Kurt. I'll get my notes out of your way.
Now, I just want to duly note that Jane went over. So, yes, you did. And last night at 11:30 and 5 o'clock this morning, I rewrote my talk twice to shorten it so it fit in the time. So I'm not going to use the shortened version. I'm going to use my original script that I brought. So we'll go from there. Okay. A few things before we get started. After hearing the speakers this morning and listening to my colleagues that preceded me, I don't know why I'm not speaking on Sunday evening after listening to the ones that preceded me. And Jane, I do have a comment on your lecture when you said about she didn't understand about a glass bed over a pool. I have a friend that has a 2-year-old. Need I say any more? You know, there's perfect sense in that, having it over a pool. Going through the Lewis Dorflinger diaries, as I have, they start in 1892 and continue through 1927. I went through, after Jane asked me to do this talk, and find all of the Corning references. And in going through it from 1893 to 1923, I found 91 references in the diaries to Corning. Now, some of them are just very, very simple references, like the very first one, which says January 30th, 1893, LJD, Lewis Dorflinger always spoke of himself in the third person, went to New York on the PM train to meet Thomas Hawks, returned home Tuesday evening on the 31st. So some are from that simple to and others, LJD went to New York Wednesday a.m., February 8, 1899, to attend the dinner of the Jewelers Association at the Waldorf Astoria that night. We had in our party Hawks, Clark, Wilson, Hall, William Francis Dorflinger, and Bergen. Returned home Thursday p.m. on the 9th. So some give you a lot of information, and some just give you a very basic. There. Okay, now we're going to start. This is Christian Dorflinger. Christian Dorflinger was born in 1828 in France. At age 10, he was apprenticed to Saint Louis. He served his apprenticeship there, and in 1846, he immigrated to this country. He worked as a journeyman glassblower, and in 1852, he started his first cutting shop in New York City. In this photograph, he is around 32 years old. It was taken about 1860, and that's the time he built his third and last glass house in Brooklyn. It was the Greenpoint Flint Glassworks. Now, what does all this have to do with Corning? Well, it all starts with this man, John Hoare. Hoare came to New York in 1853 to start his own cut glass business, purchasing from the Brooklyn Flint Glass Company their cutting department. But by 1864, the Brooklyn Flint Glass Company was bankrupt and their furnaces were cold. So John Hoare left and moved into his second cutting shop in New York City, which was in Christian Dorflinger's Greenpoint Glassworks, which you see on this 1866 billhead if you look at the second address that was given. So by 1866, he was still in Dorflinger's Greenpoint factory, cutting and selling glass from there. Late in 1864, a group of active glassmen who were Armory Houghton Sr. and Jr. bought the Brooklyn Flint Glassworks. In 1866, the furnaces were operating, but the company was still in receivership. In 1867, a disastrous fire struck the building, so it was time to reorganize the company. And at that time, in the company records, they wrote, "Resolved to move." They moved to Corning, New York, which was a major transportation hub at that time. It seems like Dorflinger, all of the glassmen moved to where there was lots of railroads and canals to ship in their raw materials and ship out their finished products. Here the men completed the first building of the Corning Glassworks in the fall of 1868. The Houghtons were able to persuade John Hoare to open a glass cutting shop, the first in Corning, on the second floor. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little here, but I want to tell you a quick story, and this is the honest to God's truth. At noon, I went back up to the exhibit galleries, and outside of the Crystal City display, there was a man dressed like a glass cutter talking to a group of about 20 people who were sitting on folding chairs right outside of it. So I stopped to listen to see if he could give me any pointers, and he said that Corning really owes its existence to John Hoare. Before that, it was just a plain, simple farming town. And John Hoare moved here and brought the industry and really got the town going. He said the people of Corning were so happy that they wanted to do something for him. So right next to the railroad station, they built him a hotel. And when you got off the train and said, "Where can I stay?" they would always say, "Go to the Hoare House." So, obviously now I know why a lot of White Mills workers moved up. In 1893, John Hoare and Company made a massive punch bowl for the Chicago World's Fair. It was 24 inches in diameter, 18 inches high, and weighed 70 pounds before it was cut. Since the Corning Glassworks did not usually make large-size blanks, it is thought to have come from Dorflinger. In Lewis James's diaries, there are 3 references, 2 in January and 1 in April 1893, all stating that Mr. Abbott and Mr. McGeorge were here at the factory. These visits must have been to talk about that punch bowl blank, because the timing coincides perfectly. So that large blank must have been made at Dorflinger at that time. The diaries also say on Friday, February 12, 1897, Mr. Houghton of the Corning Glassworks was here regarding the price of blanks. And 1 month later, Louis James Dorflinger sadly records in his diaries on March 30th, 1897, Charles Houghton, shown here, of the Corning Glassworks, shot himself in the factory at Corning. J. Hoare and Company operated this auxiliary shop in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, from 1906 to 1914, and passed its last 5 years, 1915 to 1920, in this Bridge Street building in Corning. But J. Hoare and Company did little, if any, business with Dorflinger after 1904. That's the last reference that we have in the records of them at Dorflinger's. The next glass cutting shop in Corning was T.G. Hawkes, or for those of you who know him, Sheldon Butts. Hawkes came to New York in 1863, and in order to support himself, found a job as a draftsman with the firm of Hoare and Daly in Green Point. Here on the second floor of Dorflinger's factory, he learned the glass cutting trade. By 1870, he was in Corning supervising Hoare's cutting shop on the second floor of the Corning Glassworks. But in March of 1880, T.G. Hawkes started his own glass cutting shop, obviously with Hoare's blessing, much the way O'Connor and Dorflinger did. It's really interesting to follow these four men, because Hoare and Dorflinger were born almost the same time and died almost the same time, and Hawkes and O'Connor did the same. Hawkes Cut Glassworks were moved into this building in 1882, and the cutters went to work on blanks mostly from the Dorflinger factory in White Mills. But, well, I should say not mostly. It was a combination of that and the Corning Glassworks. The next few slides are taken from salesman sample cards that I bought at a convention in Philadelphia. They were used by Hawkes salesmen in the early 1880s as a catalog. There was a box set of cards that they carried around and would show to jewelers or prospective buyers. But the next few cards that I'm going to show you, this one here shows two squat decanters, one with a handle, in Hob diamond. These exact same decanters on the exact same blanks are shown in Dorflinger's American Cut Glass Catalog of the early 1890s on page 4. This card shows a cheese plate and cover in Russian. The exact same plate is in C. Dorflinger and Sons Fine Cut Glass Catalog, circa 1886, as plate 32, number 1214. This 420 salad or fruit bowl on the Hawkes cards is illustrated in Dorflinger's American Cut Glass, page 31, as number 706 salad, cut in fine diamond and fan. Hawkes salad or fruit bowl and plate in strawberry diamond is C. Dorflinger and Sons in their fine cut glass catalog, circa 1886, plate 18, and it describes it as a 9x9 salad. Exact same blanks. The 551 salad or fruit bowl in Persian is Dorflinger's 7 by 10 salad in a variation of brilliant, shown in C. Dorflinger and Sons fine cut glass catalog of 1886. And last, this Hawks 504 dish in Princess is Dorflinger's 504 dish in a variation of Royal. So you can see that these illustrations were in both catalogs, some with exactly the same name, some the names and numbers have been changed. So it comes down to that old thing, whose glass am I collecting? In 1898, Hawks sent glass to the Paris Exposition. This is the display before it was packed for France. The punch bowl blanks were made by Dorflinger. This is a view of the exhibit in Paris, of the Davis Colmore and Company exhibit that shows the Hawks cut glass on display. One of the exposition punch bowls is shown here and is cut in Hawks' Russian and Notch pillar. It is today in the Minnesota Historical Society. When the blanks were sent to Corning, Hawks wrote Dorflinger on February 28, 1889, "They are very satisfactory to us, and we consider them as good a piece of glassmaking as we ever saw." Louis James Dorflinger began writing in his diaries on January 26, 1892. One of the first references to Hawks is on July 19, 1893. On that date, he said, "Went to Corning, leaving Honesdale on the 9:25 train, arriving at Corning at 4:50 via the DL&W Railroad. Caught the train in Scranton at 1:32 p.m. Stopped and visited with T.G. Hawks and left Corning on July 20th on train number 8 at 1:20, arriving home at 8:20. The round trip was only 14 hours and 25 minutes. By the way, I'm going to turn that in on my expense account. One of the diary entries is received by freight from T.G. Hawks and Company, one number 10-inch 804 salad mold, one number 9-inch 804 salad mold, and one number 8-inch 804 salad mold. If you look at this page from the Hawks number book, it's page 33, the top right is the 804 bowl. In 1894 in the diaries, it said these are brand new molds. So we can date exactly when this piece started to be made. Page from a Hawks catalog circa 1890-1895 shows his cut and engraved pattern. I had never seen this page till I was doing research for this talk, and was absolutely shocked to see that it is the same as Dorflinger's 276 pattern, shown here in cobalt blue. This was the X-collection of Helen N. Barger, and she identified it as 276 pattern by Dorflinger. She said she had found that amongst John Dorflinger's records, and these turn up frequently in Wayne County. After Hawks built the Steuben Glassworks in 1903, he stopped buying Dorflinger blanks from White Mills. The last Hawks reference is very late. There's a gap from like 1904 until 1907. And on June 15, 1907, he simply writes, "Met in Buffalo, Fry, Hawks, and Carter." Sam Hawks in the late 1890s would come frequently to White Mills to buy blanks. but by the time this photo was taken, he was the second president of T.G. Hawkes and Company after the death of his father in 1913. And the final home of T.G. Hawkes and Company from 1916 to 1962. The Hunt Glass Works. Thomas Taylor Hunt came to the United States about 1878. He began his career as a cutter at C. Dorflingers, but in 1881 he moved to Corning to work for Hawkes. In 1895, he and Daniel Sullivan built this cutting factory, which closed circa 1973. Oliver Egginton, who opened a glass cutting shop in Corning in 1896, was the brother of Enoch Egginton, who had previously worked at Hoare's cutting shop in Dorflinger's Green Point factory. Enoch died in 1869, and the business was carried on by his brother Oliver. The O.F. Egginton glass cutting shop in Corning, New York. Oliver's sons, Walter and Joseph, made numerous trips, according to the diaries, to White Mills in the late 1890s to 1900, presumably to buy blanks, although it doesn't say that. It just says that they were at the factory. Now we're going to go back a little. This is the Lincoln White House service from 1861. Mary Todd Lincoln ordered this when she was redecorating the White House at that time from a salesman which we could never identify, but it has always been the belief that it came from Dorflinger and that it was made at the Green Point Flint Glassworks. But we now believe that this set was done by some combination, from what I have just told you, of Dorflinger, Houghton, Hoare, and Egginton, because they all worked in Green Point in 1861, and later in newspaper articles in their respective communities, every person claimed it. So White Mills and Corning both started out together in Green Point. So that's our tie to everyone. H.P. Sinclaire, Jr. was the bookkeeper at T.G. Hawkes. By the late 1880s, he was designing delicate engravings, and by the turn of the century, he was growing restless. He was ready to move on and start his own factory, but he needed money. With the help of Marvin Alcott, trained as a banker who became his partner, he was willing to invest in H.P. Sinclaire, so in 1904, they started H.P. Sinclaire and Company. Lewis James Dorflinger recorded in his diary, "Went to Binghamton, Saturday p.m., January 30th, 1904, to meet Sinclaire. Returned home Sunday evening, the 31st, by the Erie." It is interesting to note that when Sinclaire was setting up his factory, there was a strong tie with Dorflinger. And I don't know whether they were trying to hide it or what, but all the preliminary meetings between Dorflinger and Sinclaire take place either in New York City or in Binghamton or in Elmira. Never once did they meet in Corning when they were setting up that factory. While Sinclaire looked for a factory site in Corning, his cutters worked in Dorflingers at White Mills. Lewis James Dorflinger's diary says, 2 glass cutters from Corning, Tom Dow, who is in the front row on the left, and Oliver Dow, behind the signpost, arrived in White Mills on Monday night, February 22nd, 1904, started the shop on Tuesday morning, February 23rd. He didn't give them much of a time to rest. The next day, Joseph S. Hazelbauer, engraver, arrived. By mid-March, Fred Hazelbauer and 3 more cutters arrived from Corning for Sinclaire. Now that's 7 cutters. Some of the histories that I've seen says that he started with 8, but through the diaries you can account for 7, all working in White Mills. This photograph is of Leonard Dow. He is roughing a goblet at the Steuben Glassworks in the late 1920s. Dow and his brothers William, Thomas, and Oliver, the last 2 you saw in the previous photograph, were ranked among Corning's greatest cutters. Again to the diaries. Mr. H.P. Sinclaire came to White Mills Tuesday evening, May 10th, and returned to Corning Thursday, May 12th, 1904. Everything satisfactorily arranged about shop, goods, and we can assume blanks, and etc., and etc. They were getting ready to move everything back to Corning. Now, the newspapers in both cities were having a field day. Corning said that Dorflinger was opening a branch in Corning, and the Wayne County papers said that a man from Corning was opening a branch in Wayne County, but Dorflinger was going to run it. Neither man said a word. They just let the newspapers run rampant with this. 1 month later, he records Tom Dow and his men left for Corning on Wednesday, June 22nd, 1904. Tools and etc. to be sent by rail on the 23rd. The Sinclaire factory in Corning was now ready. In this photograph, we see it in 1906. Many years later, after Dorflinger closed, some of his workmen went to Sinclaire's factory in Bath, and many made the trip back to Honesdale or White Mills to see their old employer, Lewis Dorflinger. In his diaries for the early 1920s and the mid-20s, after the Dorflinger factory closed, he talks of Emil Larson, A. Falk, and Pete Jones coming to Honesdale and taking the jitney down to White Mills for a visit, and how happy he was to see them. You can see that the jitney went between Honesdale, Hawley, and White Mills. Now I'm going to change subjects here a little, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that we have been looking into. There are an awful lot of reference to engraving in both Corning and White Mills, and an awful lot of references that I have found always talk about these Hazelbauers coming to White Mills to do the engraving for Dorflinger, because Dorflinger did not have a large or very good engraving department at that time. There were several engravings done at Green Point in the early 1860s. Some of them may have been done by Augustus Hazelbauer, but we never knew who did the majority of them. And we've stumbled on a little fact here that's probably going to shock every one of you in this room. Who did the engraving on the Lincoln glassware? If it was made in Green Point, do we actually know who the engraver was that did some of the work? And even to go on, this is when Dorflinger opened his cutting shop in White Mills in 1867 and moved it from Green Point to White Mills. This is the first dated piece of glass from White Mills. It is the Clotilda King bottle. Clotilda King was the fiancée of Eugene Dorflinger, who was Christian's cousin, and she was from a Pittsburgh glass family. He made her a dresser set with these cologne bottles and dated them December 25th, 1868. Again, who did the engraving on these? This is the first ad that appeared in a Dorflinger or in a Wayne County newspaper. In this ad in 1869, if you look, it says at factory prices, they have plain cut and engraved glassware that is made at the factory. At the same time, the local newspaper took a tour through the factory and had a very lengthy article about going through. And they were amazed when they got to the engraving department that had one sole employee. But they watched him do meticulous engraving there at the factory in 1869. They talked about him doing flowers and vines and leaves and adding monograms to pieces if it needed it. Well, we think we may have identified the man. In the William F. Dorflinger correspondence to Abby Gunn Baker, dated May 6, 1914, there's a letter book copy. And William Dorflinger states, John O'Connor, who headed the cutting department at White Mills and worked for Mr. Howarth at this time, came to Green Point during the engraving of the presidential glassware. Now that's 1861. So they're talking, and William certainly knew the difference between cutting and engraving. He was Christian's oldest son. He grew up in the business, and he knew the difference between it. It's 1914. His father was still alive. I'm sure he consulted him before he wrote that, but it answers a question for me. I purchased this goblet from Helen Barger before she passed away. It is the Catherine Merritt O'Connor glass. She bought it from Catherine Merritt O'Connor as an elderly woman in her 80s. And she said, my dad made this glass for me. He made every bit of it. It has her initials on the front, KMOC, and then the other three panels are flowers and birds. We have surmised for a long time by pieces that appear in local newspapers that O'Connor was not only a cutter, he was an engraver. And when this piece turned up, and Helen herself said that she felt this was engraved by O'Connor for his daughter, because that she even questioned Catherine on this when she bought it. We know that the only cutter, when they opened the cutting works in White Mills, they started with one frame in 1867, and it was J.S. O'Connor. So we now think that he doubled as cutter and engraver. We know from the 1914 article that he came to Green Point during the engraving of the Lincoln glassware. So it's a possibility that he may have worked on that and continued to work on pieces on down. It is strange, though, in O'Connor's obituary or anything that is written on him, it's never mentioned. The only thing he ever wanted to tell people late in life is he was the oldest living cutter in the United States. And that's what he says in every single article, that he was. This is Joseph Hazelbauer and his wife Mary. He came to this country in 1866, so we know he couldn't have worked on the Lincoln set, but we do know that he worked for Hoare and Daly in Greenpoint. So it's a possibility that he may have come up to White Mills. It seems like these men never really worked for anybody, that they were independent contractors, and they would go wherever they were needed. And again, I used to have problems with why were corning cutters always coming to White Mills whenever there was an important order, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. There's also, in a local Wayne County newspaper, a second trip through the Dorflinger glass factory on June 2nd, 1881. And it says at that time, Dorflingers had the largest cutting shop in the country with 55 cutters and 10 engravers on the payroll. So if they had 10 engravers in 1881, and it's also a possibility that both of these men worked on the Centennial set, that Hazelbauer and O'Connor may have worked. When you go back and read the local newspaper articles for this set in 1876 in Wayne County, it also says something that I've never noticed or picked up before. There are only 3 references to glass in local papers in the whole time Dorflinger was in business that it said that Dorflinger designed it. This is one of them. It said that Christian Dorflinger designed the shape and the cutting himself, so that the Centennial wine was done 100% by Dorflinger. This is a photograph of Joseph Hazelbauer working at his lathe, and if you go upstairs in the gallery, Corning has one of the best exhibits I have ever seen on how glass was engraved and cut, with the lathe set up and the boxes and the mannequins and that, and the little video running, so you can really understand it. But you can see in their exhibit that box. And the thing that you never see, this is the photograph that you always see of that box on his left with all the copper wheels in. I never knew till last night when I saw it in the exhibit, there's a drawer in the bottom, that it has a drawer. But you can see the dozens and dozens of spindles that an engraver has to work with to do the glass at that time. We know that Hazelbauer came to White Mills in 1891 to work on the Harrison White House service. And again, I couldn't understand when they're talking about, in June 16th of 1881, there's an article in the local paper that the head of the Dorflinger engraving department, a man by the name of John Flanagan, died in a boating accident, that he drowned. His obituary goes on to say that he came from Europe in 1871, went back to Europe in 1878, and came back to White Mills in 79. Certainly sounds like he was on a recruiting mission. And that he was born in Glasgow, Scotland. And he was the head of that engraving department of 10 cutters. Unfortunately, he dies in his mid-30s, and he dies 10 years before the Harrison White House set is made. But we also know that shortly after Flanagan died, a second man became the head of the Dorflinger engraving department, and his name was Joseph Schiller. And he continued working at Dorflinger till 1894, when he quit. So he was there also. But why did we need so many engravers? Well, I stumbled on a reference in Philadelphia at the National Glass Convention a year and a half ago in the Dorflinger exhibit. On exhibit was the notebook of Herman Neugenbauer, who was an engraver at Dorflingers. I went in to take my glass out the last day of the exhibit, and the book was out of the case on the table. And they said to me, if you want to take a look at it, take a look at it. So I opened it up, and there was an article in there in 1917 for the Wilson service. And it said, this was his time book. The copper wheel engraver Herman Neugenbauer engraved in 1917 and 1918, it took him almost 5 months, 175 pieces of glass for the White House. Now remember, 1917 you have electricity running the engraving lathes. In 1891 they were still on steam. They did have electricity in White Mills as early as 1881, but it was experimental and mainly just in the mansion. He engraved 175 pieces in 1,031 hours, which means that's just under 6 hours per piece, or roughly 2 pieces a day. The Harrison set was 498 pieces, and from the time it was ordered until the time it arrived in the White House was a little over 3 months. So you now know why they pulled in every single engraver within a radius of 300 miles to get that engraved, when you only do 2 pieces a day, and you've got almost 500 pieces to engrave that you certainly needed every single engraver. Here is the Harrison wine with the engraving. There's also one on exhibit up in the gallery that you can see when you go up. This photograph, the man in the lower left hand is H. William Fritchie. In the diaries, it says that he has come to White Mills looking for engraving work. And there may be slight references, although it's very hard to prove, that he did some engraving in White Mills. He was there for quite a while. So he may have also worked in White Mills, and we know definitely that he worked here in Corning. This picture is taken with his fellow engravers in Dublin in 1885, even though he didn't come to Corning until 1888. And here is the Hasselbauer family. It seems that in 1910 they formed their own little company of J.S. Hasselbauer and Sons, which is a little strange because Fred Hasselbauer was dead, but they still included his name. That is Fred Jr. on top right and George on bottom right. We know that both of these men also traveled to White Mills, and corresponding dates also tells us that they were there for major orders to be cut. They were in business from 1910 until around 1921, and we think that they helped engrave the President Mario Menaco set for Cuba in 1918. They seemed to be in White Mills at that time. And if you thought that the Harrison service was bad, with 498 pieces, this was over 1,800 pieces that had to be engraved, and that took the Dorflinger factory, the entire factory, 1 year to produce. In 1918, they worked on nothing but this service to get it out in time. So there's, even in the engravers, there is that back and forth mesh of Corning and White Mills. All through the history, they are back and forth. And again, you know, you look at some of this glass, who cut it, is what we're finding out. And the amazing thing is more information comes to light every day. We think we've got it all figured out, and what we know about the cut glass industry in both towns, I am convinced, is merely the tip of the iceberg. Any questions? Thank you.